Just past 7:33 in the morning. The show is up front. My name's Brian Edwards Teekert. Now on to the big news story of the morning. Yesterday, shortly after stock trading ended in the United States, Donald Trump rolled out what his administration was billing as Liberation Day, an announcement of sweeping across-the-board tariffs, including on uninhabited territories of other countries. The tariffs, according to the people crunching the numbers, make the U.S. the industrialized nation with the highest tariff rates in the world on its imports across the board. There's a lot of dire warnings circulating about what this is going to mean for consumers in the United States, but it's not like the trade regime that we had before this moment was exactly a panacea for everyone. So for a sober assessment of where this leaves us, we've invited on a longstanding critic of the push to liberalize trade regimes. Lori Wallach is the director of Rethink Trade Program at the American Economic Liberties Project, also a senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign. Good morning.
Good morning.
What what's your reaction to yesterday's announcement?
Hold on to your hat. So the administration gets credit for recognizing we need a total overhaul of our trade system, which the Biden administration had come to the same conclusion. And it is important that there is action taken that is commensurate with the fact that the status quo is unacceptable. The question is whether the specific policies this administration is proposing will fix the problem. And I disagree very strongly with their diagnosis of what the problem is, which focuses on other countries abusing the US. It's a much bigger problem. The whole damn system is broken. And the US, and namely bipartisan presidents of the US and big multinational corporations, had a big part in creating that broken system. It does need to be replaced, but the misdiagnosis tends to shape some of the specific proposed solutions. That said, they actually are proposing to do, we'll see what they actually do, some things that do make sense. So it's not all downside. The one thing, and there's some very important upsides that could, who knows, come out through this. The one thing that's really clear, despite a lot of uncertainties and concerns, is, and this is critical, there is likely to be corporate price gouging. Corporations are going to try and use these new tariffs as an excuse to raise prices far beyond whatever is the actual cost that their wholesale price goes up because of a tariff. So yesterday, my organization, the American Economic Liberties Project, called on the administration to take immediate action to get ahead of that price gouging. And in fact, the Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 6B, allows the Federal Trade Commission to surveil the pricing of US companies so they can get the data to make sure they're not just jacking up prices as an excuse. And there are statutory authorities to basically, under the Deceptive Practices and Acts part of the statute, to penalize companies that are basically using the tariffs as an excuse to make profits on our backs. Our strong conviction is we need to replace the old system. But it needs to be the corporations that profited and frankly profiteered off the old broken trade system who should pay for this needed transition. It cannot come out of consumers and workers getting slammed again after everything that the system of trade and corporate greed has already done.
Let's put a bracket for a minute around what you want, which I do want to discuss. But let's start on what you understand the Trump administration's theory and goals to be here, because a lot of the coverage just treats this as incompetence and chaos making. Like, if you had to steelman their position, if you had to come up with the best version of what they're trying to accomplish, what would it be?
This may not square with what they're trying to accomplish, because I think one of the questions is there are conflicting goals. But there's definitely a set of folks in this administration for whom the goal is to rebuild US production capacity so that instead of just mainly producing dollar denominated assets in a super financialized economy, we are going to produce more of the goods that we need to keep our families safe and healthy. And in the doing of that, we're going to create more good jobs for the 62% of the American workforce that does not have college degrees. And we
But
certainly have.
how does that square with the administration putting tariffs on industrial inputs like oil from Canada that gets refined in the United States? You know, things that are inputs into the value added processes that create better paid industrial jobs.
So again, there are conflicting goals. Other people in the administration want to gain revenue. Other people want to negotiate to cut tariffs in other countries, and they don't understand the problem is on the import side, but they have the same myth of free trade of we can export our way to nirvana. And some of it is mistargeting. So one of my big questions as sort of a recovering trade attorney is why some of the countries that are being targeted for specific higher level tariffs have been chosen. Because at this point, the whole global trade system is so broken and so unbalanced that it can't deliver the potential benefits of trade. You need a system that clears, is the technical term, that's not in severe imbalance. We have a situation now where while the US is by far the biggest global chronic deficit country, there are 66 other countries in the world who are in year after year big trade deficits. And the ones you wouldn't expect. They're industrialized developing countries that also, for instance, have tariffs up against China, Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil. Those countries have as their sort of cause of woe, as do we, 19 countries that are chronic trade surplus countries. They use what are often called beggar thy neighbor policies of suppressing wages or consumption at home, of manipulating currency values to get a trade advantage, of subsidies left, right, and center. And those countries, China being the biggest one, but not exclusively, it includes Germany, frankly, but also Japan, Korea, Taiwan, others. Those countries are basically using a set of policies that are ostensibly advantageous for certain wealthy sectors of their economies, but are not great for their workers either. But that imbalance means none of us are getting the benefits of trade. So in my view of, what should happen is you should target the big surplus countries. That's not what they did. They targeted 60 countries. So to step back, what the policy is 10% across the board tariffs on all countries, but there's a thing called Annex 2, if you look at the executive order, that lists certain sectors that are excluded. And that includes all energy products, just to deal with your particular question about oil imports. So they have taken out energy products, but there are a variety of other things that are included that, one might not include. If I had a magic wand, I would take out coffee, bananas, mangoes, things we just cannot produce at scale here under any circumstances. They include in their exclusion some minerals and inputs into manufacturing. They also have a thing that is smart, but opens up a lot of cheating possibilities. And this gets to your tariffs on inputs. So excluding the oil and gas, important, but also, there are a lot of parts. Over time, one would hope some of the supply chain in autos and other really important fundamental industries relating to health. So, active pharmaceutical ingredients, not just the medicines, more of them being made here, or communications equipment, sustainable energy equipment, so solar, EVs, etc. You would want some of that coming home in the supply chain, but in the interim, they have a rule, if you dig into the executive order, that reduces the tariff based on the US content. So it's basically creating an incentive to have supply chain investment here too. You have to start with at least 20% of domestic content, and then the tariff is only charged on the non-domestic content. So there's some logic to it. But again, are they targeting the right countries? And here's the even bigger problem. If they are aiming at really rebuilding manufacturing, what we have seen is contrasting the first Trump administration, where they did just tariffs but didn't do any of the other industrial policies. They did not get a boom in manufacturing construction, new factories. The Biden administration actually raised tariffs considerably above what Trump 1 had done, but they also paired that with the essential other policies. So those tax credits that we all saw for EVs made in the US or for US made solar panels, that meant they were creating private sector demand, a demand for those goods. They strengthened Buy America rules, so the government buying more of that stuff. So you create demand for the good that you are protecting. Similarly, they had tax credits for manufacturing. So if you make a new plant, you get a tax credit. You are driving private sector investment. And as a result, by 2023, they had the highest rate of US factory construction investment in 30 years. This administration instead is attacking those programs like the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. They're trying to hoover out that money, take away those tax credits, and they have no similar plan that they are saying is the substitute. So when you look at practically what one of their ostensible goals is versus will they deliver on it with this methodology, that's where, though they get credit for seeing we have a big honking problem, the question is, what they're doing deliver the outcomes, whatever the outcomes they actually are after might be.
Can you tell who's in the driver's seat? Like when you're going through the text and seeing some nuanced distinctions, like that exception for imports with U.S. made components, but like what does that suggest about who's actually contributing to the text coming out of the Trump administration?
The best way I can describe it is a stew with with various
Maybe a
ingredients.
potluck.
Well, I was going to say there's some ingredients in that pot I am totally happy about, and there are some other ones where I'm thinking, who the hell invited the auto mechanic to put things into the kitchen? It's there. There are things that are smart. So one thing that is worth noting, um, California Congresswoman farther down, Congresswoman Linda Sanchez just put in a bill to close what's called the de minimis loophole. It's this crazy old loophole that allows any package valued below a certain amount to be sent in to a U.S. resident every day, duty-free, inspection-free, tax-free. And it's become now 4 million packages a day, mainly from China, mainly stuff ordered online. It's become a
This is the
huge.
business foundation of websites like Temu, where you buy things that are shipped directly from China, so there is no import, there's no tariff on what you purchase. It's ridiculously cheap.
And also, I might add, there's no inspection, there's no customs. It's really dangerous because dangerous stuff, fake stuff, unsafe stuff is getting into the tsunami of 4 million packages a day. Okay, one of the things in the executive order is they're closing that, which of course is a smart thing to do, is what the Democrats have been calling on, is basically what their executive order has is more or less Democratic Congresswoman Linda Sanchez's bill. But down the road, different part of the list of things in that. So that's smart. There are a lot of questions of how they'll enforce it, when they'll do it. It's not immediate. Though they do close that loophole for China, bang, shut the door, actually, with the executive order. But for the rest of the world, so we'll see what happens. But then, you go a few pages in and you look at the chart of countries that they're having higher tariffs. So it's 10% across the board, minus certain products. And then there's a list of 60 countries that are going to get higher tariffs. And the methodology they've used, ostensibly, and this is a sort of theme of reciprocity, is the tariffs are to reflect what the other country's policies are. Except that's probably not the methodology they use. They basically looked at which countries had a bigger bilateral trade deficit. So we have some global deficit countries on that target list. But also, depending on the target of the tariff, they are or not actually a manufacturing problem country. So when you look at that, you think, okay, how did they pick those countries? Why would you go after that one versus I would actually do a higher rate on that one? And so, to your point of who's in the driver's seat, I think to, totally mix the metaphor beyond all recognition, there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen simultaneously.
We had you on some years ago during the first Trump administration, and you were pretty pleased with how renegotiation of NAFTA, what became the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement, came out under the Trump administration. There was someone named Robert Lighthizer who was doing most of the negotiating on behalf of the Trump administration. That agreement has since been crumpled up and thrown out the window by the current version of the Trump administration. I guess like my question is, who are the people that are calling the shots? Are there any notable figures with relevant expertise in his immediate orbit?
Yes. So two different questions there. The person who is the new Robert Lighthizer is actually his former chief of staff. And this is a guy named Jameson Greer is the new U.S. trade representative. And Jameson Greer is actually a smart, informed, honest lawyer. And he has, to the extent there are things in this executive order that make sense, a lot of that is his being very knowledgeable. And I would say he is focused on the goal of rebuilding US production capacity, trying to keep out the imports of those chronic surplus countries, the mercantilist countries, the countries that use the policies in their own production that make it nigh impossible for even the most excellent US producer or producers in other countries to possibly compete because it's a form of basically trade abuse. So he is there. There are other folks who are involved in this who I would say are less informed on some of the details or how to translate the theory of what you want to do to the policies. And then there certainly are some folks in the administration who just have a totally different view. The Treasury Secretary has continued to talk about targeting a handful of countries to try and get them to cut their tariffs so we can export more, when the actual problem of these imbalances is on the import side, targeting those 19 severely mercantilist countries, you would have a lot of trade rebalance, and there's no way to export our way out of it. So I think it's a little bit all over the place. The one thing I want to go back to, though, is even with all of that, one very clean, clear thing we need to be doing, and a lot of members of Congress are starting to think about this, is we need to get a thing that they are not including in their executive order now, and they have not talked about, which is anti-price gouging action. So again, the current Federal Trade Commission statute has both existing authority to surveil what corporate pricing is. We've heard all of these earnings calls. We have corporations saying things like, well, in anticipation of tariffs, we're just going to raise prices. If they are raising prices unrelated to what their actual higher cost is, that is price gouging. And not only does the Federal Trade Commission statute, Section 6B, allow the Federal Trade Commission to surveil pricing, but the Deceptive Practices and Acts Authority allows sanctions against it. It is one thing if the increased cost from a tariff is passed on, which, by the way, sadly, there's so much concentration in particularly retail, and there's such record high corporate profits amongst the big companies and such record low corporate taxes, they are well situated to absorb the additional tariff cost in many circumstances. Because just so your listeners are clear how this works, when there is, say, a 25% tariff on something, the tariff is charged on the wholesale. So the Nikes that cost $120, they've set that price because they've done research knowing that is the price at which they'll have the largest unit for the largest number of volume of sales. So they will basically, they know if they go $130, bigger profit margin, but less units sold. Yet the shoe comes in from Vietnam or China, and maybe it's $24. Literally, the markup is like that. And so the tariff would be charged on the wholesale. So when it comes in, that would mean $24 shoe, 25% tariff, $6 is added to the price. So now the cost for the retailer is $30 for a shoe that they're still going to send for $120. So there's a margin in there where the extra cost can be absorbed by taking it out of the profit margin. And that, by the way, the sort of best studies of what happened with Trump's first term tariffs on $350 billion of stuff from China, 20% on average tariff rates. That's largely what happened. We didn't see those tariffs went into place 2018, 2019. We didn't see inflation jump until COVID. It was mid 2020. So that didn't trigger inflation. It didn't trigger a lot of prices jumping. But this time around, on all these earnings calls, we have heard lots of corporations making noises about raising tariffs, raising prices, whether or not they are facing tariffs. And so that price gouging action is going to be critical because otherwise we could actually
see. And so just to be clear, the theory here is that all the coverage around the tariff increases produces cover for a company that wants to raise prices without inducing sticker shock in its consumers. If people are already expecting price increases, you can get away with a lot more.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the story we always hear is in Trump's first term, he raised tariffs on washing machines. And we hear the story, washers and dryers prices went through the ceiling thanks to the tariffs. The only hitch to that is it is true that the price of dryers went up. There were never tariffs on dryers. It was just the hype of washer and dryer. They kind of go together, salt and pepper. And so the companies just decided that they could get away with it. And they did. And then the prices were raised way more than the actual cost the tariff put into the wholesale. And the prices went up, like in Canada, for washers, a lot more than even what the US tariff was, but there was no tariff in Canada. So it's exactly what you describe. It's using the excuse. And, it would be a horrible double whammy if all the hysteria attacking tariffs for raising prices led to higher prices.
Lori Wallach, I guess the other question that we haven't really addressed is consistency. There have been so many announcements and reversals and re-reversals just in the past couple months of skirmishing with Canada and Mexico over tariff rates. If you look at this as policy, it's hard to say which policy private firms making investment decisions are supposed to calibrate to.
That's right. So I think that there are, 5 big questions about whether we are going to see the outcomes perhaps one could accurately describe as what Democrats have been asking for in trade since before NAFTA and WTO, which is a more balanced, more fair system that works for working people. The goal of that compared to the outcomes and questions around the actions taken yesterday, number one, what is the real goal? Is anything about manufacturing the real goal? Is this about gaining revenue? What is the goal? Number 2, though, is how long are they going to put these tariffs in place and keep them? This gets to the certainty and to consistency. So the on and off roller coaster of tariffs we've seen in the first 2.5 months of the administration, that's not going to have any investor agreeing to move their money into building a new factory in the US. And for that matter, it's not even going to make a sourcing agent in a company that's finding intermediate parts for construction here of some good likely to change the sourcing because you don't know what's going to happen the next day. So when you have this kind of roller coaster of on and off tariffs, you end up having investors more likely to reach for a barf bag than a checkbook. And the problem
Right.
there is they've spent 2.5 months playing that game. So now, even if they've put these tariffs in place and they intend to keep them in place, everyone is assuming it could all disappear overnight. And that is a real problem. The use strategically and successfully of tariffs involves consistency and leaving them in place. So they're going to have to not be doing one-off deals, doing exceptions on and off again for some months before they're likely to attract any sort of certainty. A next problem is, by the way, related to that.
Oops. You know what, Lori? I just took a look at the clock and we're not going to have time for the next problem, but maybe we can have you back on again soon. Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
Would love to. Thank you.
Lori Wallach is director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. She is also senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign. That does it for Upfront this morning. We are weekdays at 7 a.m. Get in touch by emailing upfront@kpfa.org. A big thanks to our producer, Kimya Akbari, our engineer, Kirsten Thomas. My name is Brian Edwards-Teekert. Thanks as well to Mitch Jeserich and Christina Onnested. Stay up, stay tuned. Law and Disorder with Kat Brooks is coming your way in 1 minute at 8.